That thing cannot be parked here. The voice was sharp, brittle, and drenched in the kind of unearned authority that sets my teeth on edge. I looked up from the engine block of my classic Mustang, a project I'd been nursing back to life for the better part of a year. Standing at the edge of my driveway, hands planted firmly on her hips, was Brenda Miller, Empress of the Oakmont Creek Homeowners Association. She was pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my company truck, a gleaming white Ford F-350 with the words Apex Paving and Construction lettered immaculately in navy blue on the door. It was parked on my property, precisely where the HOA covenants stated a vehicle could be. I wiped a smear of grease from my knuckles with a rag and stood up slowly. I'm not a small man, a fact that years of military service and decades of running a heavy construction company have solidified, but I move quietly. It tends to unnerve people who expect bluster. It's a commercial vehicle, Mr. Thorne, she continued, her voice rising as if to fill the space my silence created. Article 7, Section 4, Paragraph B of the covenants clearly prohibits the overnight parking of commercial vehicles unless they are actively engaged in services for the residents. I let the silence hang for a beat longer. I had read the covenants, all 128 pages of them. I'd read them before I even closed on the house. It was standard procedure for me, the same way a soldier conducts reconnaissance of new terrain. Know your environment. Know the rules of engagement. Good afternoon, Brenda, I said, my voice calm and even. I'm familiar with the section. It specifies vehicles over 1-ton classification or those with exposed equipment or ladders. My truck is a 1-ton, and as you can see, there's no exposed equipment. It's my personal vehicle as well as my work vehicle. It's in compliance. Her face, already tight with indignation, seemed to shrink. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her eyes before being extinguished by a fresh wave of self-righteousness. The spirit of the rule is to maintain the aesthetic of the neighborhood. That truck is an eyesore. It lowers property values. She gestured vaguely at the peaceful suburban street as if my truck were a toxic waste spill. I am the president of the board, and I am telling you, it needs to be moved. You can park it in your garage. My garage, which currently housed the half-disassembled V8 engine of the Mustang, was obviously not an option. This was not about the truck. This was a power play, a test. She was establishing dominance. It doesn't fit in the garage, I stated simply. It's parked on my property in accordance with the bylaws you cited. It's not moving. The color began to rise in her cheeks, a mottled crimson that clashed with her blonde hair. You'll be receiving a violation notice, $25, and it will be $25 for every day the vehicle remains. She spun on her heel, a maneuver of pure theatricality, and marched back toward her own perfectly manicured lawn across the street. She had just declared war. She had no idea I had spent 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in infrastructure and logistics, and another 10 building a multi-million-dollar company by mastering the art of contracts, regulations, and bureaucratic warfare. She thought she was swatting a fly. She had just poked a bear who was an expert at dismantling ecosystems like hers, piece by meticulous piece. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a siege. And her little cardboard castle was about to come down. If you've ever had to deal with a petty tyrant drunk on the smallest sip of power, you're going to want to stick around for this. Hit that subscribe button, because this isn't just a story about a truck. It's a field manual on how to dismantle an insurgency of one. The first violation notice arrived 2 days later, as promised. Certified mail. A classic intimidation tactic. It makes things feel official, weighty, legally binding. To a layman, it's scary. To me, it was the first piece of evidence. I opened a new file on my computer desktop, Project Nightingale, named after the street we lived on. I scanned the notice, saved it as a PDF with a time-stamped file name, and placed the physical copy into a clear plastic sleeve. This sleeve went into a fresh 3-ring binder. The binder was labeled simply HOA. This is the first and most critical phase of any engagement: intelligence gathering and documentation. An emotional response is a wasted response. Anger is a poor substitute for a well-organized file. I spent that evening conducting a detailed analysis of the situation. The target, Brenda Miller. The objective, Removal of the threat to my peace and quiet enjoyment of my property. The method, overwhelming and systematic application of her own rules and the laws she was likely breaking. My first step was to establish a baseline of her authority. I downloaded a fresh copy of the HOA covenants, bylaws, and any amendments from the county registrar's website. I didn't trust the welcome packet version. I wanted the official, filed with the government documents. I spent the next 4 hours reading them, not as a homeowner, but as a contract lawyer, which I very nearly was before the allure of building things won out over arguing about them. I highlighted every clause related to vehicle parking, property maintenance, and the powers and responsibilities of the board. I cross-referenced sections, made notes in the margins, and created a separate document outlining every potential ambiguity or point of leverage. As I suspected, Section 7.4b was poorly written, full of loopholes a competent attorney could drive my F-350 through. The next day, I installed a new security system. Not just a doorbell camera, but 4 high-resolution, night vision-capable cameras covering every angle of my property. One was aimed directly at my driveway. Another had a clear view of the street and Brenda's house. All recordings were uploaded to a secure cloud server. Documentation is not just paper. It is video, it is audio, it is an unblinking, impartial witness. The second violation notice arrived a week later. Another $25. I repeated the process. Scan, save, file. I then drafted my first official response. It was not an angry letter. It was a cold, formal, legal inquiry. I cited the specific covenant she was referencing. I explained in precise and technical language why my vehicle was in compliance. I attached the vehicle's official spec sheet from Ford, highlighting its GVWR and classification. I then formally requested, pursuant to the state's property code governing HOAs, a hearing before the full board to dispute the violation. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. This was key. It forced a response and created a legal paper trail. Her move. While I waited, I began phase 2, reconnaissance of the wider operational area. I started taking walks around the neighborhood in the evenings. I wasn't just exercising, I was observing. I noted every minor imperfection that could be a potential violation according to Brenda's strict interpretation of the rules. A slightly faded mailbox here, a patch of brown grass there, a basketball hoop left out 5 minutes past the 9 p.m. deadline. I took pictures with my phone, the metadata embedding the time and location. I wasn't collecting blackmail. I was establishing a pattern of arbitrary and selective enforcement. My truck was a pristine, new vehicle. Mrs. Henderson's peeling trim, however, had gone unnoticed for years. Mr. Garcia's work van, filled with ladders and racks, was parked behind his fence, a technical violation of the visible from the street clause, yet he had never received a notice. The pattern began to emerge. The targets were almost always new residents, single women, or the elderly. People less likely to fight back. People who would just pay the fine to make the problem go away. Brenda wasn't just a tyrant. She was a predator, and she was funding her little kingdom by preying on the vulnerable. This was her fatal mistake. She assumed I was just another transient homeowner who would roll over. She failed to conduct her own reconnaissance. She had no idea she was trying to find a man who had once coordinated the logistics for a billion-dollar airfield construction project in a hostile zone. Her $25 fine was about to become the most expensive mistake of her life. The response to my request for a hearing came not from the board, but from Brenda directly. It was a curt, dismissive email. The board has reviewed your case and the violation stands. Please remit payment of $50 to avoid further action. This was a gift. She had denied me my due process, a right explicitly granted in the bylaws. Scan, save, file. I now had her, in writing, violating the very rules she claimed to be enforcing. The binder was getting heavier. My next step was to expand my intelligence network. It was time to talk to the other residents, not in a gossipy, over-the-fence way, but methodically. I started with Mr. Chen, a retired engineer who lived 2 doors down. I'd seen the violation notices taped to his door before. His infraction? His trash can was visible from the street for 3 hours after the garbage truck had come. I caught him while he was watering his hydrangeas. Mr. Chen, I began, keeping my voice low and conversational. Mark Thorne from down the street. I was wondering if you've had any issues with our HOA president. His eyes, friendly a moment before, clouded with a weary frustration. Ah, Queen Brenda, he sighed, setting down his hose. Yes, it is the trash can this week. Last month it was the color of my welcome mat. She said it was not a subdued earth tone color as required. He shook his head. I just pay the fine. It is easier than fighting. My wife, she has a heart condition. The stress is not good for her. Would you be willing to write down what happened? Just a simple statement, dated and signed? I asked. I'm compiling a record of these incidents. I believe she's overstepping her authority. He looked at me, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He was an engineer. He understood the power of data. Yes, he said, nodding slowly. Yes, I would. He was the first. The next was Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. Her late husband had planted a magnificent bed of prize-winning roses along their front walk. Brenda was fining her because a few of the bushes had grown to touch the sidewalk, a violation of the landscaping setback rule. She was in tears when she told me the story, clutching a framed photo of her husband. These roses are all I have left of him, she whispered. She told me if I don't rip them out, she'll have the HOA's landscaper do it and bill me. This was no longer about a truck. This was about cruelty. It was a textbook case of an insurgency run by a petty dictator, creating fear and division to maintain control. I took Mrs. Gable's statement, assuring her that her roses were not going anywhere. I felt a cold, controlled fury solidifying in my chest. This woman's reign was going to end. Over the next 2 weeks, I spoke with a dozen other residents. The stories were all variations on the same theme. A young military family fined because their son's plastic slide was the wrong shade of green. A single mother cited for an oil stain on her driveway the size of a quarter. Each story was a data point. Each person a potential ally. I collected sworn affidavits from 7 of them, each one meticulously documented and added to the binder. I was no longer a lone operator. I was building a coalition. During this time, I also started digging into the HOA's finances. As a homeowner, I was entitled to review the records. My first request was ignored. My second, sent via certified mail from my lawyer, was reluctantly granted. They gave me a time slot at the management company's office and allowed me 1 hour to review the books. They thought they could stonewall me. They didn't realize I could audit a balance sheet faster than Brenda could write a violation notice. I arrived with a portable scanner and a purpose. The records were a mess, a deliberate tangle of sloppy bookkeeping and vague expenditures. But I had spent years poring over contractor bids that were designed to hide graft and overruns. This was amateur hour. I focused on 2 areas, the fines and the maintenance contracts. The income from fines was staggering, far more than a well-run community should ever generate. It was being funneled into a discretionary fund that Brenda controlled. The maintenance contracts were even more telling. The landscaping company, the pool service, the security patrol, they were all charging rates 20 to 30% above market value. And then I saw it, the big one, a line item for pavement condition assessment and engineering study. It cost the HOA $15,000. The study concluded what was obvious to anyone with a working set of eyes. The neighborhood roads were nearing the end of their service life and needed to be repaved. The estimated cost of the project was an astronomical $1.2 million. The contractor who performed the study, a company I'd never heard of called Precision Roadworks, was also the sole bidder recommended for the job. I scanned every document related to the project. The bid was a joke, padded with unnecessary expenses, using substandard material specs, and filled with boilerplate language. It was designed to look impressive to a board of amateurs. To me, it looked like fraud. I went home and spent the night digging into Precision Roadworks. It took less than an hour to find the connection. The company was registered to a holding LLC. The registered agent for that LLC was a man named David Miller, Brenda's brother-in-law. The trap was set. She had no idea she was walking right into it. This had escalated far beyond a parking dispute. This was now a criminal conspiracy to defraud the homeowners of this community, and I had the beginnings of a federal wire fraud case sitting in my binder. The fines, the harassment, it was all a smokescreen. The real goal was this paving contract. It was her multi-million-dollar payday, and she was using her position as HOA president to ram it through. She thought my truck was the problem. She was about to learn that my truck was owned by the one man who could not only expose her scheme, but could also do the job for half the price. The official notice for a special community meeting arrived the following week. The agenda was singular: a vote to approve a special assessment to fund the complete repaving of the neighborhood roads by Precision Roadworks. Brenda was making her move. This was the moment she would leverage the fear she had cultivated, pushing the massive expenditure through before anyone could mount a proper opposition. She had scheduled it for a Tuesday night, giving only the minimum required notice, hoping for low attendance and a quick, quiet victory. This was her final, fatal mistake. She assumed my silence was submission. In reality, it was the quiet before the storm. I spent the next few days preparing for the meeting as if it were a legal deposition or a battlefield briefing. I contacted my network of aggrieved homeowners. 7 of them confirmed they would be there. Mrs. Gable, emboldened by our alliance, promised to come, bringing a small photo of her husband and his roses. Mr. Chen would be there, armed with his meticulously documented timeline of the trash can harassment. I updated the binder. It was now nearly 6 inches thick, a heavy, dense tome of pure data. It contained the bylaws, the violation notices, my correspondence, the affidavits from other residents, the HOA financial statements I had scanned, the corporate filings for Precision Roadworks, and a detailed analysis of their fraudulent bid. As a final touch, I prepared my own company's bid for the same project. Under the name Apex Paving and Construction, I drafted a proposal that was a masterclass in civil engineering. It used superior materials, a more efficient paving method, and came in at a total cost of $650,000, nearly half of her brother-in-law's quote. I printed 20 copies. The day before the meeting, I made a call to a friend from my Army days, a man who now worked as a senior investigator for the State Attorney General's White-Collar Crime Division. I didn't file a formal complaint yet. I simply laid out the situation, forwarding him a summary of my findings. I told him about the meeting and asked if he thought it constituted a potential conspiracy to commit fraud. His response was a single chilling sentence: "I'll have a couple of my people in the area tomorrow night, just in case." He didn't need to say more. The pieces were in place. All that was left was for the Queen to walk onto the stage and deliver her lines. The community clubhouse was exactly as I expected: cheap fluorescent lighting, uncomfortable folding chairs, and the faint smell of stale coffee. Brenda and her 2 cronies on the board, a timid-looking man named Arthur and a woman with a perpetually sour expression named Carol, sat at a folding table at the front. Brenda was in her element, radiating a smug confidence. She saw me walk in, and a flicker of triumphant malice crossed her face. She saw me as the vanquished, the man with the ugly truck, forced to attend a meeting that would cost him thousands. She had no idea I was the executioner. I took a seat in the back row, placing my heavy binder on the floor beside me. My allies trickled in, taking seats around the room, giving me small, nervous nods. Mrs. Gable clutched her purse, the corner of the photo frame peeking out. Mr. Chen sat ramrod straight, his face a mask of grim determination. There were perhaps 30 residents in total, most of them looking resigned and unhappy. Brenda began the meeting with a flourish, her voice oozing a false sincerity. "Thank you all for coming. I know a special assessment is a difficult thing, but the safety and beauty of our community are at stake. Our roads are crumbling." She launched into a PowerPoint presentation, filled with scary-looking photos of minor cracks in the asphalt. She then introduced the solution: the $1.2 million proposal from Precision Roadworks, a company she described as a highly respected leader in the field. She spoke for 20 minutes, laying out the payment plan, the timeline, the supposed benefits. She never mentioned her connection to the company. When she finished, she smiled brightly. "Now, I know this is a big decision, so before we vote, the board will open the floor to a few questions." Her eyes scanned the room, deliberately avoiding me. A few residents asked timid questions about the cost. Brenda deflected them with practiced ease, using jargon and fear to shut down any real discussion. The engineering is very complex, she'd say, or delaying will only increase the cost and the risk of a lawsuit if someone trips and falls. Finally, when she thought the crowd was suitably cowed, she said, "Any final questions before we call the vote?" This was my cue. I raised my hand. Every head in the room turned. Brenda's smile tightened. She couldn't ignore a direct request in a public forum. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and placed the 6-inch binder on the table with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "I don't have a question, Brenda," I said, my voice calm but carrying to every corner. "I have a presentation." I opened the binder. "My name is Mark Thorne. I've lived in this community for 6 months. In that time, I, along with at least a dozen of my neighbors, have been subjected to a campaign of harassment, intimidation, and illegal fines by this board, under your direction." A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's face went from smug to crimson in a heartbeat. "This is out of order. We are here to discuss the road contract." "I am discussing the road contract," I replied, my voice turning to ice. "But first, we need some context." I turned to the residents. "Mrs. Gable, would you mind telling everyone here why the board is threatening to destroy your late husband's rose garden?" Mrs. Gable, trembling but resolute, stood up and told her story. Her voice, though soft, was filled with a strength that captivated the room. Then Mr. Chen stood and described the endless harassment over his trash cans. One by one, my allies stood and spoke. It was a cascade of testimony, a litany of petty abuses that painted a clear picture of a tyrant ruling through fear. With each story, Brenda's face grew paler, her composure cracking. When they were finished, I turned back to the binder. "This is not just about harassment, it's about fraud." I held up the corporate filing for Precision Roadworks. This company, which you've presented as a highly respected leader, is an LLC registered to your brother-in-law, David Miller. Gasps rippled through the room. Brenda shot to her feet. "That's a lie. You have no proof." "It's a public record," I said calmly, placing the document on the overhead projector for all to see. The room fell silent as they read the name. "You have used your position as president to push a non-competitive, grossly inflated contract to a family member in direct violation of state law and this HOA's own conflict of interest policies. This isn't a bid, it's a theft of over $500,000 from every homeowner in this room." I then put the Precision Roadworks bid on the projector, next to the one from my own company. "I'm a civil engineer. I spent 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, building roads, runways, and critical infrastructure all over the world. After that, I founded Apex Paving, one of the most successful heavy construction firms in this state." I gestured to the two documents. "This bid from your brother-in-law is garbage. It specifies the wrong asphalt mix for our climate. It pads the labor hours by 40%, and it quotes a price for materials that is nearly double the market rate. It is, in short, a criminal document." I looked out at the faces of my neighbors. They were no longer timid or resigned. They were furious. The spell of fear was broken. "My company," I continued, "can pave every road in this neighborhood using superior materials and a longer-lasting deep lift technique for this price." I pointed to the $650,000 figure on my proposal. "This is what an honest bid looks like." Brenda was sputtering, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. "You can't! My truck! You're nobody!" she stammered. "I'm the man whose truck you decided to make an issue of," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "And in doing so, you drew my attention. You forced me to look. And what I found was a pattern of corruption so blatant that I had a moral and legal obligation to act." I closed the binder. This entire binder, documenting every illegal fine, every affidavit, every financial discrepancy, and every piece of evidence related to this fraudulent contract, has been copied and forwarded to the State Attorney General's office. As if on cue, two figures stood up from the back of the room. A man and a woman dressed in plain business attire. They looked utterly out of place, and yet commanded the room's attention instantly. "Brenda Miller," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "We're investigators with the Attorney General's office. We have a warrant to seize all financial records, computers, and communications related to the Oakmont Creek HOA. We'd like you and the other board members to come with us. We have some questions for you." The color drained completely from Brenda's face, leaving it a pasty, slack-jawed mess. Her cronies, Arthur and Carol, looked like they were about to be physically ill. The illusion of power, so carefully constructed, shattered into a million pieces. The queen had been dethroned, not by an army, but by a binder full of paper and a man she'd underestimated. The room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, it began. A single person started clapping, then another, and another. Soon the entire room, save for the 3 terrified board members, was filled with applause. It wasn't for me. It was for themselves. They were free. The aftermath was swift and systematic. The AG's investigators were professionals. They spent the next week at the management company's office, conducting a forensic audit that peeled back years of financial mismanagement. What I had uncovered was merely the tip of the iceberg. Brenda hadn't just been planning one big score with the paving contract. She had been bleeding the community dry for years through a network of kickbacks and bogus fees. The discretionary fund was her personal slush fund, used for everything from luxury vacations disguised as fact-finding trips to paying for her lawn service. Brenda, her brother-in-law David, and her 2 loyal board members were all charged. The list of indictments was long: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, multiple counts of embezzlement, and violations of the state's public trust statutes. Faced with the mountain of evidence in my binder, which the AG's office lovingly referred to as Exhibit A, Arthur and Carol folded immediately. They took plea deals, agreeing to testify against Brenda in exchange for probation and community service. Their testimony painted a damning picture of Brenda as the ringleader, a manipulative bully who coerced them into compliance with threats and promises. David Miller's company, Precision Roadworks, was revealed to be a shell corporation with no equipment and no employees, created for the sole purpose of funneling the paving contract money to himself and Brenda. He was charged separately, and his contracting license was permanently revoked. Brenda, ever the narcissist, refused to believe she had done anything wrong. She insisted on a trial. It was a spectacular miscalculation. The trial was a public humiliation. One by one, her former neighbors, the people she had terrorized for years, took the stand. Mrs. Gable, with quiet dignity, told the jury about the threats to her husband's roses. Mr. Chen presented his spreadsheet, a document of such meticulous detail that it drew a smile from the prosecuting attorney, detailing every fine and every harassing email about his trash cans. The prosecution used my documentation, my video evidence, and the testimony of her former allies to methodically dismantle her defense. The jury was out for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge was not lenient. He spoke of the profound breach of trust, of preying on the elderly and vulnerable, and of the arrogance of her crimes. He sentenced her to 5 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 3. He also ordered her to pay restitution to the HOA for every dollar she had stolen, a figure that ultimately topped $250,000. She had to sell her house, the very house from which she had surveyed her little kingdom, to pay for her legal fees and the initial restitution payments. The last I saw of her, she was being led from the courtroom in handcuffs, her face a pale, defeated gray. Justice isn't always a thunderclap. Sometimes it's the quiet, methodical clicking of a scanner, the rustle of paper, and the final heavy slam of a prison door. With the corrupt board gone, the court appointed an interim receiver to manage the HOA's affairs until a new democratic election could be held. The first act of the receiver was to declare all of Brenda's outstanding fines null and void. A wave of relief washed over the neighborhood. The reign of terror was officially over. A special election was held 2 months later. Mr. Chen, the quiet engineer who had been afraid to fight back, was nominated for president. He accepted on the condition that I would serve as the treasurer, at least for the first year, to help untangle the financial mess Brenda had left. I agreed. Our first act as a board was to rewrite the covenants. We clarified the ambiguous language, removed the ridiculous aesthetic rules, and put in place strict transparency and conflict of interest policies. We created a community that was based on mutual respect, not on fear and intimidation. The ridiculous rule about welcome mat colors was the first to go, ceremoniously struck from the records at our first official meeting to a round of cheers. Then we addressed the roads. We put the project out for a proper public bid. 10 companies submitted proposals. Apex Paving submitted the same bid I had shown at that fateful meeting. After a thorough review by an independent engineering consultant and a vote by the new board, my company was awarded the contract. It was all done by the book, transparently and professionally. My crew started work a month later. I was on site every day, not as a resident, but as the project manager. We worked efficiently with minimal disruption to the residents. We milled the old, cracked asphalt, regraded the roadbeds, and laid down a thick, smooth layer of hot mix asphalt that was rated for 20 years of service. My F-350 was parked on the street every day, not as a violation, but as the command vehicle for the operation that was rebuilding the community's foundation. The irony was not lost on me. The very symbol of Brenda's tyranny had become the instrument of the neighborhood's renewal. We finished the project 2 weeks ahead of schedule and nearly $10,000 under budget. The surplus was returned to the HOA's reserve fund, the first deposit into an account that was now healthy and growing. The new roads were flawless, a dark, smooth ribbon tying the community together. It's been 2 years now. Brenda is still in prison. The neighborhood is thriving. People decorate for the holidays without fear of getting a violation for using the wrong color lights. Kids leave their toys in the yard. Mrs. Gable's roses have never looked more beautiful. They now creep over the sidewalk in glorious, defiant abundance. And no one says a word. Mr. Chen is a fantastic president, leading with fairness and common sense. I'm sitting on my front porch, a glass of iced tea in my hand. The Mustang is finally finished, its restored engine rumbling with a deep, satisfying purr in the garage. My F-350 is parked in the driveway, clean and quiet. It's just a truck. But sometimes a truck can be a catalyst. It can be the small, immovable object that brings a corrupt and unstoppable force to a grinding, spectacular halt. I never wanted to fight. I just wanted to be left alone. But when a tyrant comes to your door, you have two choices. You can bow, or you can build a better kingdom on the ashes of theirs. I am, after all, in the construction business. And that was a demolition and rebuilding project I will always be proud of.